University that was published in the Journal of Educational Sociology. Thrasher attacked Wolverines against comic books thoroughly, pointing out that he provided no credible research data, and the comic books he criticized were only the most extreme examples. However, such an article would never come from the hearing. Clendenin did cite "Are You a Red Dope?" ad by Rip Gaines, calling it an attempt to distract the committee. Dr. Harris Peck was the opening witness, the director of Bureau of Mental Health Services for New York City Court of Domestic Relations, which took a middle-of-the-road approach to the issue, stating comic books were neither good nor bad. Henry Schultz, the attorney for the ACMP, was the second witness and was forced to admit that the ACMP was ineffectual, with only 12 members and there's three of the 30 largest publishers. In many ways, Schultz sounded defeated, as he genuinely believed the ACMP could have worked, but the defections from the industry made it to fall apart. At the conclusion of his testimony at 12:20 p.m., the hearing was called to recess for lunch. However, Bill Gaines, who had been popping Dexedrine and NoDoz for the whole time to stay awake, wasn't hungry and was just getting wound up to testify. Frederick Wervin was the first witness following the lunch recess, recounting his own book and, as usual, referring to all comic books as crime comics. He even suggested that despite Seduction of Innocence being selected as the book of the month, he was worried distributors would keep it from being published as the sinister hand of these corruptors of children of this comic book industry. Wervin also attacked Superman, providing the infamous statement, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. That they got children much younger. They teach them race hatred at the age of 4 before they can read." This statement particularly incensed many comic book creators in comparing them to Hitler, as a great deal of them were not only Jewish, but served in World War II fighting the Nazis. Bill Gaines was particularly outraged and vowed to take Wervin down. Gaines was called next, where he cited his own father, Max Gaines, the founder of EC Comics, and in many ways the founder of the industry itself, having been instrumental in making famous Funnies, the original modern comic book. Bill Gaines asked, "What are we afraid of?" Gaines argued EC's stories taught racial tolerance, but as testimony continued, he started to stumble from the Dexedrine that was wearing off. Finally, under questioning of Junior Counselor Herbert Beezer, Gaines was questioned about how they tested the comic books for the content, implying that only the limits were on what sells. Gaines countered it was based on what was the bounds of good taste and what he considered to be good taste. At this point, Senator Kefauver saw his opening and held up the cover of Crime Suspense Stories number 22 by Johnny Craig, which depicted a murderer holding a bloody axe in one hand and a woman's severed head in the other, asking the question, do you think this is in good taste? To which Gaines replied, "Yes, sir, I do," for the cover of a horror comic. Reportedly, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby were watching the hearings and immediately groaned at Gaines's answer, with Simon muttering, "Stupid, stupid." The next day, on April 22nd, the New York Times read the article, "No Harm in Comics," issue says, by Max Lerner, citing Gaines's comment. He was immediately decried around the country and even grouped with mob figures, with some readers believing that Gaines was connected to the mob. Not off base, but the wrong industry figure, as that would be Harry Donenfeld, the founder of National Publications, the future DC. The hearings ended that day, the same day as McCarthy hearings began on the House of Un-American Committee, but the damage was done. With one statement, Bill Gaines had nearly sunk the industry his father helped found. Creators were ostracized due to the backlash. Bob Olson was denied admittance to a synagogue, and when Dick Ayers tried to donate comic books to a charity, he was told to burn them instead. On May 10th, the Buffalo Evening News began with a 5-part Horror for Young Readers, All for the Price of a Dime by Arthur L. Davis. It reprinted transcripts from the hearings, which Henriksen read on the Senate floor to be recorded in the congressional record. The Cleveland Press did a 4-part series on blood, violence, and sex in comic books by Bob Ruffendahl, and purchased comic books like Crime and Punishment, Chamber of Thrills, and Web of Evil, and Teenage Romance. Bernard J. Conway, the Cleveland police prosecutor, ordered a purge of these books and a new statute calling for a $500 fine and 6 months in prison for the sale of them. Only one letter of dissent came against it from John M. Mosberger, who blamed working mothers instead for juvenile crime. Senator Henriksen soon scheduled another hearing in June, which Bill Gaines wrote to in protest while rallying EC comic book fans into the 5 issues of their fall comic books. Henriksen attacked Gaines on the Senate floor and held a hearing on June 4th in room 110 again at the Foley Square Courthouse. However, this one wasn't televised. It did have Thomas C. Hennings, Richard Clendon, and Herbert Beezer, along with 8 other witnesses from the College of Henriksen, a New Jersey bar, and New York State Assemblyman James Fitzpatrick. This hearing focused on the sales and distribution of comic books and how to give dealers great discretion in the books they sold. Fitzpatrick quoted from the Panic comic books My Gun is My Jury, which was a satire of the comic book detective Mickey Spillane, and called for a federal regulation of comic books. On June 23rd, Massachusetts Attorney General George Feingold announced an agreement to halt the circulation of objectionable comic books. The National Sheriff's Association voted for horror comic books to be regulated along with the National Council of Juvenile Court Judges. President of General Federation of Women's Club, Mrs. Theodora S. Chapman, called for a war on lurid comics. The collection of College of Parents and Teachers agreed on July 10th, along with the Ladies Auxiliary of Military Order of the Purple Heart and the ABA League. A few of the voices did crack through, though, as Dr. Rocco Mato and Salcal psychiatrist said comic books made an easy target because they were not defended well. It was alone the voice of dissent in the wilderness. As a result of the backlash, EC comic books started to see their sales plunge. Lyle Stewart argued that Gaines should fund a new study on comic books by Eleanor and Sheldon Gluck, Harvard researchers. He also pushed for publishers at a meeting in New York. First, 9 publishers showed up, then 13, and by the 4th meeting it was industry-wide with 38 publishers. It took place at the Biltmore Hotel in Manhattan on August 17, 1954, where Gaines paid the bill. Elliot Kaplan, writer and editor at Totally Press, and the brother of Lil Abner creator Al Cap, was the chairman, while John Goldwater, publisher of Archie Comics, was in charge of the organizational committee. The intention was to form a new association to replace the ineffectual ACMP. It became the Comics Magazine Association of America and would establish a new code of conduct. They even offered Frederick Warburton to be hired on as an independent overseer. Notably, the new code banned the words horror and terror from the titles, but not crime, thanks to crime design publisher Lev Griffin. With this turn of events, Bill Gaines left the meeting he started, as it quickly became apparent to the other publishers was not just going to use it to self-regulate the industry, but to run EC comic books out of business. On September 7, 1954, the CMAA was incorporated with 26 publishers, including National, Timely, Archie, Harvey, Quality, Gleason, and St. John. Only 3 declined: Dell, Gilbertson, and EC Comics. Dell and Gilberton were already wholesome with classic literature comics, thus didn't need a code. EC stayed out of the code due to being designed against their very comic books. Plus, Stewart and Gaines hated John Goldwater, who was president of the association. By the second week, he had drafted the Code of Ethics with a $100,000 budget. Goldwater in turn hated DC over their Archie parody, Starchy, from Mad Magazine. However, the CMAA declined to hire Frederick Warburton and instead hired Charles F. Murphy, a 44-year-old New York City Municipal Court judge, to be the code administrator, with Henry E. Schultz being retained from the ACMP as chief counsel. Murphy had created the Youth Tells It Over radio program and ran Teen Plan Incorporated. According to future DC editor Dick Giordano, he was as clean as they come. The CMAA also hired Radar and Finn Agency for September 16th press conference. Preceding it, Gaines announced on September 14th that EC Comics was discontinuing its horror and crime comics, with a new line to be released in 1955. Much of this was due to the company losing $40,000 on a combined circulation of 2 million comic books. Gaines planned to invest $250,000 in this new line, realizing his only choice was to change in order to survive in the new climate. The final issues of his horror and crime comic books had an in memoriam editorial titled "We've Had It," which joked that obviously this would lead to a less crime. The CMMA held their first press conference 2 days later at the East 42nd Street and 5th Avenue to announce the new code, which finally came out on October 27th as the Comics Code Authority, CCA for short. It would have 5 full-time censors and will eventually prove to be more rigid than the ACMP, the FCC code for radio, and the Hays Code for movies. It banned violence, bigotry, and supernatural content, resulting in an enormous loss of creative freedom, who also could no longer disrespect authority in their stories. Time previously praised the CCA on September 27th, though local governments still pursued bans against comic books. On November 1954, Los Angeles moved to ban certain comics, with a new law to be passed in February of 1955, and ultimately the code did little to settle the public debate. That year, a Gallup poll showed that 70% of Americans blamed comic books for juvenile crime, though the poll noted consisted mostly of older, non-comic book readers. In the LA Times, writer Francis L. Igg and Louis B. Ames reprinted a lengthy defense by a 17-year-old, only to refute it in the next column. In Ohio, Operation Book Swap was launched, in which 10 comic books were turned in, you got a free book. It was run by Rich Walter Lutwitz, and on March 14th at Stonebank Elementary, they turned in the comic books were burned. For 6 months in 1955, the American Legionary Auxiliary continued book swap across the country, though it later discovered many kids just did it for the money. Plus, the American Book Publishers Councils and the ACLU complained, leading to in the end of the comic book burnings, which were instead just dumped in the trash. The attacks on the comic books spread overseas as well, as Peter Mauger, a communist and writer at the Daily Worker and Arena, said that comic books were proof of the American vulgarity in the UIC. On May 1952, he wrote in picture posts in the article, "Should U.S. comic books be banned?" Both the Daily Dispatch and the Times of London agreed, and on January 1955, the British cabinet announced a bill, Children and Youth Persons Harmful Publications Act, to ban horror comic books. The bill passed on February 22, 1955, an interesting irony considering it was just 2 years after Fahrenheit 451 was published by Ray Bradbury, which depicted books being burned in the future by a despotic government. An ironic twist in the novel, the only books not burned are volumes deemed of no particular value, of practical value, are those beneath contempt. Trade journals, pornography, and comic books. Meanwhile, at the CCA, Charles F. Murphy was zealous in his new job, rejecting 126 stories the first year alone and requiring numerous changes for approval. Ultimately, 38 titles would be canceled as a result. He called for desexualizing females and was faithful to the code to the letter. Often comic books had the white-out images instead of drawing changes just to make deadlines. One example was a knife being removed in an action scene, but not the slash marks on the victim. Even villains were made to look nice in comic books as a whole became very bland. It wasn't long before Charles F. Murphy became the most hated man in comic books, and as he was sanitizing the industry to the point of blandness. However, Fitzpatrick thought the CCA was inadequate and called Murphy to a February 4, 1955 hearing. At the same hearing, Frederick Werven appeared and testified he was able to buy a knife out of an ad in a comic book. However, when questioned, Werven could not, as usual, recall what comic book ad was in, once again lacking any evidence to his claims. Nevertheless, Fitzpatrick declared the CCA ineffectual on March 21st and then proposed legislation banning lurid comic books and sales to kids under 18. On May 2nd, Governor Ira Harriman signed the new bill into law with a punishable fine of $500 and 1 year in jail. Back in the UK, horror comic books were banned 4 days later. The legislation on the whole essentially outlawed comic books, with many states following suit, though Reuben C. Peterson of Wisconsin fought against it, believing they were gone too far after comic books. While he received some severe backlash, Peterson's efforts did help in defeating the legislation of Wisconsin, at least. The effect was almost immediate on the industry. In 1952, there were 500 different comic books being published, but by 1955, it was down to just 300. Numerous publishers from Fiction House, Comic Books Media, Timber, and Stan Hall went under, while new companies couldn't even start, since Mainline by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. On October 19, 1955, a film from Fitzpatrick's hearing aired on Confidential File, with Irwin Kershner, the future director of Empire Strikes Back, which, in full disclosure, is my personal favorite movie, providing stage sequences such as kids reading a stash of comic books they found in the woods. Host Paul Coates said it led to violence, an LA Times columnist. He gave Senator Kefauver differential treatment in his interview, with a U.S. flag flying behind him. Kefauver would use this to run for president again and announced his candidacy in December. However, he would lose in the primary to Audley Stevenson again and would later brawl with a then unknown John F. Kennedy for the vice presidential slot, but losing that nomination as well once again. This inadvertently set up JFK for his future presidential run in 1950 and would later say, "I guess it's a lot to Estes." Senator Kefauver would continue to serve in the Senate and even work with President Kennedy, later pushing through the Kefauver-Harris Drug Control Act in 1962, which provided controls in the prescription drug industry, including having to disclose side effects, and those holding patents had to allow generics of their drugs after a certain period of time. Kefauver would call this his final achievement of his career. The next year, on August 10th, he died from complications due to a heart attack and stroke he suffered on the Senate floor 2 days earlier. Meanwhile, EC continued to promote its new Clean line. 7 titles were published on January 1950: Valor, Piracy, Aces High, MD, Extra, Psychoanalyst, and Impact. The company still produced Mad and Panic, though. And while weird science fantasy was changed to incredible science fictions, though despite popular belief, the word weird was not banned from the titles in the CCA. The comics lacked bite, though, and while EC stayed out of the CCA, preventing them from being sold on major newsstands despite their content. After selling just 15% of their run, Gaines tried to join the CMAA after the fact. However, even after joining, EC would soon leave comic books altogether, with its last being Incredible Science Fiction on February 1956, when the issue was cover dated in November 1955. Reportedly, Murphy rejected the image of a sweaty black man in the comic book. Originally, he objected to over his race, but when Gaines pointed